Hello and welcome to Grace vs. Law. Should churches welcome known sex offenders? Presenters for this session are Jay Keevy, who serves as the coordinator for CBF South Carolina and as the CBF Global Abuse Prevention and Response Advocate, and Carrie Nettles, who is an Alliance of Baptist endorsed chaplain at the Julie Valentine Rape Crisis and Child Advocacy Center in Greenville, South Carolina. This workshop will discuss how to have a grace-filled conversation regarding the issue of sex offenders and whether to safely include known sex offenders in church programming. You'll hear from them for 25 minutes, and then we invite you to join in a live Q&A session to continue the conversation. You'll find all the info you need to join that Zoom conference at the embedded link in the description. You will also find any presenter notes available there as well. We hope you will join in, and we are glad you're here.
Welcome, friends, to our General Assembly workshop session titled Grace versus Law. How should churches include, welcome known sex offenders? This session came about because of recent conversations I've had with clergy in CBF life and outside of CBF life about kind of the best ways to include people who they know are on their local sex registries. I've included a conversation partner for this workshop, my good friend, Reverend Carrie Nettles, because she and I were having this conversation recently in relation to a colleague of hers. So Carrie is an Alliance of Baptist endorsed chaplain at the Julie Valentine Center, which is a rape crisis child advocacy center here in Greenville, South Carolina. She's the mom of two great kids and married to Mason and a shepherd raising sheep at her house. Carrie, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation.
Thank you for having me, Jay. And for those of you who don't know, Jay, for several years now has been the director of the CBF of South Carolina Association and has been a longtime friend and champion that I just personally am so grateful for, Jay. And more recently, Jay has been named to the role of Abuse Prevention and Response Advocate for CBF Global. So what I want you to take away from that is if you have issues in any of this realm, just please call Jay.
So Carrie, say a word about the spiritual impact of abuse, since you see that every day as a chaplain, and that's part of why this is a conversation that's so important for churches.
Absolutely. Well, the spiritual impact of child abuse and sexual assault in general, in addition to the impact from the ways in which church and church leadership have responded to these issues, it's just immeasurable, right? So we do have data that tells us from an article by Walker et al. In Changes in Spirituality that roughly half of all survivors of child abuse and sexual assault will find a way to make meaning again, to integrate the trauma that they've experienced within a larger framework, and we'll find some healing and we'll be able to utilize the resilience and coping tools that are naturally inherent in the life and body of a faith community, the church at her best, and in their own spiritual practices. And at the same time, roughly half won't be able to find a way to mend that broken meaning making, and won't have access to the resilience of spiritual tools and nourishment. And so, of course, our goal is to bring that number down, right? We want to help people find the very best ways for them to heal on the other side of this.
So it's important to understand that there likely are survivors of sexual abuse in all of our congregations. You know, we know that the high prevalence of abuse makes that extremely likely. And so we need to take exceptional care as we include known offenders in the congregation. So let me say a word quickly about what the sex offender registry is. It was created by law, about 2 decades ago. So people who are convicted of sexual assault or child sexual abuse, often as a part of their sentencing, are required to register as sex offenders. But the registry itself is not protective. So we know that people who are on the sex offender registry reoffend at the same rate as people who are not. We also know that the number of people who plead down sexual offenses to some other assault offense is higher now that there's a sex registry. So we can track that change over time. And so when we see a sex offender registry, we need to understand that in itself is not protective of a congregation. So a congregation needs to do its own work to protect the children and vulnerable adults in their midst. But if you do have someone who is on the sex offender registry and you want to include them in the life of your faith community, there's some important work that you need to do. We'll talk about that in just a second. Remember, that Jesus warned the disciples about wolves in sheep's clothing who come and devour. And so as we think about people who are on the sex offender registry, what that communicates to us is they've been discovered as wolves. And so we need to understand that it's our responsibility to protect our congregations from people we know to be wolves. And as we talk about the basics in just a second of including, welcoming folks who are on the sex offender registry into your congregation, remember, we're going to ask them to demonstrate that they are in fact sheep and not wolves. So we'll start with these 5 basics. And the first one is never allow a known offender into the faith community with their victims. So Carrie, could you say a word about that?
Absolutely. Yes. So the church isn't the sanctuary for people anymore if they are forced to worship alongside and with their offender. So if you have a person who, we know that they have offended, they may or may not be on the sex offender registry. Most sex offenders are not on the sex offender registry. And then their victim or victims are part of the same congregation. That offender really needs to go to another church. He's lost privileges. I say he just because demographically it's more often a he, but that's women do offend too. That's part of the consequences of their choices. And if we want to be the church to everyone, we can find other communities for offenders, communities that have really good, safe offender participation policies and can keep them from reoffending on their sheep, if you will. And then we continue to create as safe a place as possible for the victims in our midst to continue healing. And Jay's absolutely right. Let me just underscore, you absolutely have survivors in your congregation. Roughly 20% of your congregation are survivors, and 67% of your congregation love survivors, have married a survivor, parent a survivor. So this is part of the life of your church, whether we know it or not.
So excluding a known offender could be a part of keeping some of those victims safe, feeling safe, knowing they're safe in your community. So that's the basic number one, never allow known offenders in the faith community with their victims. The second one is discovery versus disclosure. So we want sex offenders who want to be a part of a community of faith to come and disclose their status on the offender registry with leadership of the church before they become a part of the community of faith. If we discover someone is on the registry before they have disclosed it to us, that's immediately disqualifying, because we have to wonder, why haven't they? Why are they there? What are they trying to get away with? They should disclose, and then work with the congregation toward whatever terms of participation are appropriate. But the basic of discovery versus disclosure, if you discover someone is on the registry before they disclose it to you, that's immediately disqualifying. You should not include them in your congregation. But if someone discloses, we want to see repentant behavior. Carrie, can you say a word about what that means? What behavior do we want to see in an offender if they come to our congregation?
Absolutely. Not only do we want them to disclose upfront what charges were filed against them, what they were ultimately convicted of, because sometimes those are different things, like Jay just pointed out. Sometimes the initial charge is criminal sexual conduct against a minor under the age of 8, and ultimately the plea deal is assault and battery 1. So if we have a sincerely repentant individual who is coming to be a part of the community of faith, they need to disclose all of those details up front. And if they disclose part of the truth and try to shape the story or tell a story in a certain way that is favorable to them, and then you go on to discover more details about that, like it was CSC against a minor under the age of 8. That's the part they didn't disclose to you. That is red flag behavior. That is indicative of someone who is not fully contrite and repentant. They are trying to cover up things. A truly repentant person will be willing to accept the consequences, the fullness of the consequences of their behaviors. They won't be trying to pull wool over your eyes. They will agree to terms like, no, I will never ask to volunteer with youth and minors. Yes, I understand that while I'm on the campus, I will be accompanied by a team of sponsors at all times who can double check my behavior is appropriate and proper. Yes, I do give you permission to liaise with my probation or parole officer and my sex offender therapist, so that you can always understand and work with my team for best practices for me and for everyone. Because remember, ultimately, it is not good for us to be stuck in sin. It is not. So the most loving thing we can do as church and church leadership is to help the sex offender not fall into temptation, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Carrie. Thank you. The third basic, and my observation is this might be the hardest one for churches, is to start with no and work toward yes, include them in the congregation. Every church I know is loving and forgiving and welcoming and wants people who struggle to be a part of their faith community. And so often churches are inclined to start with yes, and then we'll figure it out. But we really need to start with no. We know that you are a wolf, and then invite them, in conversation and in some of the ways that Carrie just discussed, to demonstrate that they are sheep before we say yes. That's the hardest work of clergy, I'm sure, to say no first. Now, a no, you can't be a part of our worshiping community or community of faith, is not an ultimate no. It's not, we can't care for you in any way. There may be ways where you can care for them off campus, where you can have, sort of a small study somewhere that includes them. These days they can participate in worship online. But you need to start with no and then work your way toward yes, just to ensure the safest inclusion for your church. The fourth basic is get help before including offenders. So one of the ways you work toward yes is finding people who can help you understand the offender's experience on the way to saying yes. So Carrie, who are some of those people that can be assets in making this decision?
Absolutely. So I want to encourage you to reach out and connect with your local rape crisis center and your local child advocacy center. These are the people like where I work at the Julie Valentine Center. We hear day in and day out the impact of what their abuse experiences have wrought for them, right? And the ways that they are struggling to heal and trust again, and maybe even work their way to being able to forgive. But we need to be able to hear from the experts in how someone's sex offender crimes have impacted others. These are some of the people who know the MO of sex offenders and how they think and how they operate, how they exploit the cover of religiosity. You can call me, but also, and then reach out to your law enforcement, the whatever the division is called in your local municipality that deals with sexual violence crimes and crimes against children. Those officers have worked with these folks. They know. Reach out to the probation parole folks and say, hey, what do we need to do? Reach out to clinicians in the area, therapists and psychiatrists who work with sex offenders and who know the limitations of their rehabilitation on this side of
Yeah.
glory.
Yeah. Thank you, Carrie. That's exactly right. You have resources in your community who would be very willing to help you discern. I'll put in a plug for CBF partner Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. Part of we can connect you to Grace to also be a part of that kind of conversation, evaluating inclusion of offenders. So the final basic number 5 is everyone needs to know. So sex offender registries are public information. You can search for anybody's name in lots of different ways. And so because it's public information, it's information that's available to everybody at church already. But if you're going to include a known offender in your worshiping community, that worshiping community needs to know from you at church. And they need to know on a pretty regular basis, annually, biannually, just to say, here are people who worship with us who are part of the sex offender registry. And here's why we say that. Because it's easy to foresee a circumstance where an offender behaves at church all the time for years. And, a young family joins and they see this person they know from church at the grocery store or at a restaurant. And because they don't know that they are an offender, they may, outside of the church context, develop a relationship where that offender can manipulate them and then ultimately isolate and offend, harm, their children. And so I can't imagine how angry a parent would be to discover that they had been worshiping alongside someone who harms children, with their children present in the church. And so it's just a good practice and a good commitment. And the offender would know that, on a regular basis, we're going to let folks know that there's an offender in our midst. And we can do that in ways that are not shaming. The purpose is not to heap more trouble on the person, but it is just a good part of care for our flock. So we've included in a handout that you should have access to as a part of this workshop, a model policy. We won't take the time to read all of it to you, but I want you to notice that the last paragraph. So the model policy captures all of these basics that we talked about. I want to draw your attention especially though to the last paragraph, which says, when a known sexual offender seeks participation with Safe Baptist Church, senior pastor designate will consult an independent child safeguarding specialist to evaluate the participation request and formulate a ministry plan. And the things in that ministry plan may include the kinds of things that Carrie mentioned a second ago, with sponsors who go with them everywhere, limitations on what kind of programming and things that they can come. But the important part of this policy is you don't jump right to formulating a plan. You make sure there's an evaluative process before the plan so that you know this person is safe to include in your congregation. So, Carrie, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. Thank you all for attending our workshop. I look forward to hearing from you and extending this conversation. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for Grace versus Law. You are now invited to a live Zoom discussion. Please follow the link in the description to join.